Feel the time was right to do this?
Yeah, well, I didn't really think about it. I just felt time to make a record.
He was the quiet one, the spiritual seeker, the Beatle who found peace in meditation and Indian philosophy. But behind that calm smile lurked one of rock's harshest critics. George Harrison had zero tolerance for what he thought was fake, shallow, or copycat music. While John cracked jokes and Paul played diplomat, George would just say, "They're rubbish," and walk away. Today, we're revealing the 6 bands that George Harrison despised the most. From bitter rivalries, to cutting one-liners, to feuds whispered about for decades. Some will shock you. Others will confirm every suspicion you've ever had about George's razor-sharp taste. Number 6. The Monkees. In the mid-1960s, Beatlemania ruled the world. And then suddenly, here came the Monkees. 4 cheeky guys on a TV screen, playing instruments, cracking jokes, selling the dream. To millions of kids, they were America's answer to the Beatles. But to George Harrison, they were a bad joke with guitars. That's not a band! When a reporter dared compare the 2 groups in 1967, George cut him down instantly. That's not a band. That's a television show. He didn't just see the Monkees as competition. He saw them as an insult to everything the Beatles had fought for. Because George remembered Hamburg, the sweat, the endless sets, the years of slogging through smoky clubs just to get noticed. And now here came 4 actors, cast by producers, handed instruments, and launched into stardom overnight. Beatles roadie Mal Evans recalled how deep the hatred ran. If a Monkees song came on the radio, George would instantly change the station. One night, when he couldn't turn it off fast enough in a hotel room, he smashed the radio instead. That wasn't rivalry. That was rage. The breaking point came when George discovered the Monkees didn't even play on their own early records. Session musicians handled the instruments while the actors posed for cameras. For George, this was unforgivable. It was the ultimate betrayal of music itself. "You can't retroactively earn authenticity," he reportedly ranted. "That's not how art works." He compared it to a TV doctor suddenly demanding to perform real surgery. Pretend is pretend, and George wasn't buying it. Things got truly awkward when the Beatles and Monkees crossed paths at a Hollywood party. Mickey Dolenz tried to strike up a friendly chat. George leaned in and whispered, "I'd rather talk to the caterers. At least they earned their place here savage and unforgettable." But here's the twist. Years later, George mellowed. In an interview, he admitted, "They were just kids caught in the machine. My issue was with the machine, not them. It showed that beneath the sharp wit, George's beef was never really with the Monkees themselves. It was with the system that manufactured them." So why did the Monkees kick off George Harrison's list of most despised bands? Because they represented everything he hated. Music without struggle. Fame without foundation. A fantasy built for TV. George Harrison valued authenticity above all else. And to him, the Monkees weren't a band at all. They were an illusion. Friends say he still wouldn't go near a Monkees record. Number 5. The Doors. Jim Morrison called himself the Lizard King. But to George Harrison, he was more like the Emperor's new clothes. George hated pretense, and to him, the Doors were drowning in it. Jim's leather pants, his cryptic poetry, the brooding stage persona. It all rang hollow to George. Pseudo-intellectual nonsense wrapped in mediocre musicianship. Beatles insider Tony Bramwell recalled him saying, George wasn't dazzled by mystique, he wanted honesty. And he thought the Doors were selling a costume. Friends say George would regularly parody Morrison at parties. He'd puff out his chest, drop his voice an octave, and improvise gibberish, "I am the Lizard King of absolutely nothing." It always got a laugh. Because George didn't just dislike the Doors. He thought they were funny. In 1968, the Beatles and the Doors shared space backstage at the Hollywood Bowl. Robbie Krieger, eager to connect, approached George about Indian music influences. George's reply, "You wouldn't know a sitar from a guitar strap." Cold. Blunt. Classic George. That one sentence captured his whole view of the band. Pretending to be deep while skating on the surface. Even in private, he didn't hold back. In letters to Eric Clapton, George roasted Ray Manzarek's playing. Ray thinks he's Bach because he can play with two hands. If that's genius, then Aunt Mimi is Chopin ouch. To George, Manzarek's organ riffs weren't brilliance. They were party tricks. And yet, George wasn't completely immune. There was one Doors song he admitted had something. The End. The sprawling, haunting track caught his ear. He called it accidentally interesting. It wasn't exactly praise, but it was as close as George ever got to complimenting Morrison and company. So why did the Doors bother him so much? Because they embodied the one thing George hated above all else: posturing. They weren't just playing music, they were playing characters. And George Harrison, the Beatle who chased spiritual truth, had no patience for rock stars pretending to be prophets. In the end, the Doors wanted to be a religion. But to George, they were just another rock band, and not a very good one. Number 4, the Rolling Stones. The Beatles and the Stones, forever linked, forever compared. But while the world framed it as a friendly rivalry, George Harrison quietly saw the Stones as copycats. George's judgment was brutal. "They built a career following our breadcrumbs," he allegedly told producer George Martin. The timeline seemed to back him up. When the Beatles dropped Rubber Soul, the Stones came out with Aftermath. When the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper, the Stones countered with their Satanic Majesty's Request. To George, it wasn't influence, it was imitation. "Write your own bloody map," he grumbled, and here's where it gets complicated. Because George loved Keith Richards. They'd jam on weekends, trade riffs, bond over the blues. But the moment George left Keith's side, he'd unload on the Stones. Peter Brown, a Beatles associate, described it best. He compartmentalized it. Keith was his mate. The Stones were his punching bag. It was the ultimate contradiction. He admired the man, but despised the machine. In 1967, the Stones' infamous drug bust dominated headlines. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were painted as counterculture martyrs. But George didn't buy it. He saw it as self-promotion. "Jagger's playing at Revolution while we're actually trying to cause one," he sneered to friends. To George, their rebellion felt like theater. Flashy, loud, and empty at the core. And decades later, the contempt still lingered. When Mick Jagger was knighted in 2003, George's reaction was scathing. "Mick spent 50 years trying to be us. Now the Queen's bought it too." It was the kind of line only George could deliver. Dry, witty, and brutal. Yet, here's the irony. The Beatles and Stones shared the same DNA, rooted in the blues, obsessed with Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters. George's frustration may have come not from their differences, but from their similarities. Because when he looked at the Stones, he didn't just see rivals. He saw shadows of the Beatles, but louder, flashier, and always a step behind. So while the world painted the Beatles verses, Stones as a duel of equals, George never bought into it. For him, the Beatles were the map makers. The Stones were the tourists, tracing the lines, and George Harrison had no patience for tourists. Number 3. The Bee Gees. Disco. To most of the world, it was glitter, lights, and endless nights on the dance floor. To George Harrison, it was the sound of musical betrayal, and the Bee Gees were public enemy number 1. George's dislike for the Gibb brothers didn't begin with disco. As early as 1968, he complained to Beatles manager Neil Aspinall, "They're photocopying our ballads and smudging the results." The Bee Gees' early pop harmonies? Too polished, too safe. To George, they sounded like a watered-down Beatles B-side. But things were about to get much worse. By the mid-70s, the Bee Gees reinvented themselves. Out with ballads, in with Stayin' Alive. Saturday Night Fever made them kings of disco. But to George, this wasn't reinvention, it was capitulation. Disco is mankind's cultural rock bottom, he reportedly raged to friends, and the Bee Gees, fellow Liverpool lads, were leading the charge. According to his longtime friend Klaus Vormann, George saw it as a betrayal. They had talent, he said, but they sold it for sequins. Here's the cruel twist. George's own record label, Dark Horse, distributed Bee Gees records in some regions during the height of Saturday Night Fever. Executives claimed he refused to hear sales figures. "I don't need to know how many people are paying for auditory punishment," he allegedly snapped. Imagine that. George Harrison, spiritual Beatle, making money from the very sound he despised. No wonder it made him furious. Fast forward to a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame event. The Gibb brothers were in the room. George was too. Witnesses say he deliberately avoided them the entire night. At one point, he leaned over to Ringo and whispered, "I've taken vows against musical opportunists." Cold, classic George. But the story doesn't end in snark. When George was battling cancer, Maurice Gibb reportedly sent him a heartfelt letter of support. It showed something few knew, that behind all the bitterness, there was still respect between musicians, even if George never admitted it. So why did the Bee Gees cut so deep? Because for George, they weren't just another band chasing trends. They were Liverpool boys like him. They had the roots, the grit, the authenticity, and in his eyes, they threw it all away. That's why the Bee Gees weren't just another band George dismissed. They were a reminder of what he feared most in music: talent sacrificed for fashion. Number 2, Oasis. Fred Astaire wasn't just a dancer. He was gravity's biggest rival, gliding, leaping, spinning, making the impossible look effortless. But here's the thing about effortlessness. It takes work. And part of that work was glued right on top of his head. Fred began balding early. By his mid-30s, the shine was hard to ignore. For most men, no big deal. But for Fred, a crisis. Because Astaire wasn't just selling talent. He was selling an image: youth, charm, elegance. So his stylist got creative. And when I say creative, I mean engineering-level creative. His toupees weren't ordinary wigs. They were precision gear, ultra-fine silk bases, hand-knotted strands, adhesives so strong they could survive sweat, lights, and 10-minute dance marathons. Imagine rehearsing for swing time, jumping, twirling, sliding across the floor, the camera rolling in one unbroken shot. Fred's heart pounding, not just from the choreography, but from the unspoken fear. What if the hair comes off? Spoiler, it never did. His wigs were tested and retested until they were practically bulletproof. Co-stars noticed. Ginger Rogers once teased, "I had to dance backwards in heels." But Fred, he had to make sure his hairpiece never moved an inch. And here's the genius. His hairpieces weren't too perfect. They were styled just a little off. A natural cowlick here, a strand out of place there, because perfection would have made the illusion less believable. In the end, Fred Astaire's hairpieces did more than cover baldness. They became invisible dance partners, silent collaborators in every number. Think about it. He was dancing on ceilings. He was defying gravity. And the one thing that never fell? His wig. Number 1, the Beach Boys. George Harrison's number 1 musical nemesis wasn't a brash British rival, wasn't a noisy punk act. It was America's clean-cut surf kings, the Beach Boys. Now, to Paul McCartney, Brian Wilson was a genius. He called God Only Knows the greatest song ever written. But George? He thought the Beach Boys were the definition of empty calories. Musical Coca-Cola, he sneered. All bubbles, all sweetness, and gone in a sip. It started innocently enough. 1965. A friendly meetup. But when the Beach Boys asked George how the Beatles got their guitar sound, he was floored. "They don't even understand their instruments," he told John afterward. "I should have told them. Learn how to play first." From that day, George saw them not as peers, but as amateurs in fancy packaging. Then came Pet Sounds, the album that pushed Paul McCartney into overdrive, inspiring Sgt. Pepper. Critics called it a masterpiece. Paul called it life-changing. George? He dismissed it as 4 good tracks buried under conceptual quicksand. To him, it was proof the Beach Boys were all about glossy arrangements with no soul underneath. During Beatles listening sessions, he'd even use their records as cautionary tales. "Don't do this," he'd say. "This is what happens when you confuse layering with meaning." In 1968, fate threw them together again, this time in India. The Beatles and the Beach Boys, side by side, at a meditation retreat. Dennis Wilson tried to strike up a deep spiritual conversation, but George, the most committed of the Beatles to Indian philosophy, wasn't impressed. "Surfing isn't transcendence, mate," he reportedly told Dennis. "It's just getting wet." That single line summed up everything George thought of the Beach Boys. Shallow, surface level, play acting at depth. Fast forward to 1988. The Beach Boys are inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The stage is packed with legends. The room is electric. But George? He sat stone-faced through their performance. When someone asked what he thought, he delivered the coldest line of all. America finally found its answer to the Beatles. Unfortunately, they asked the wrong question, and yet, the story doesn't end there, because tucked away in George's personal record collection was a copy of God Only Knows. He never bragged about it, never admitted it publicly, but it was there, a crack in the armor. Proof that even in his fiercest judgments, George wasn't blind to brilliance. So why did the Beach Boys earn the top spot on his blacklist? Because George Harrison had one golden rule: authenticity. And in his eyes, the Beach Boys were the opposite of that. Manufactured image, shiny harmonies, no grit, no truth. He respected mastery. He respected struggle. And the Beach Boys, for him, symbolized none of it. Still, the fact that God Only Knows sat quietly on his shelf tells us something deeper. That even George Harrison, the harshest critic in rock, couldn't fully silence the part of himself that recognized beauty, even when it came from a band he despised. And there you have it, the 6 bands that tested the patience of the so-called quiet Beatle. From TV-made pop stars, to psychedelic poets, blues imitators, to disco kings, George Harrison had no problem calling out what he thought was fake, shallow, or just plain irritating. But here's the thing. Behind the sharp words was a man who cared deeply about authenticity. If he criticized you, it's because he believed music should mean something, not just sell something. So now we want to hear from you. Which of George's musical feuds surprised you the most? And do you think he was being too harsh, or just brutally honest? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love digging into the hidden rivalries and untold stories behind music legends, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. Because sometimes the truth behind the music is even juicier than the songs themselves.